It was an identity panic. My identity was I was the good kid. And so when I was faced with something that, started to push against that identity, it was like I was coming apart inside.
Is there a certain pattern that you recognize what is going on with the parents of a gifted child?
Their amygdala is twice the size of somebody in the more average range. Gifted kids are really, really good at covering up where there's vulnerabilities. The school system is not designed to work with anybody in an extreme developmental profile. It is designed for the average.
Welcome to the ReeThink Podcast, and today I have another guest with me. Introduce yourself, Mark.
Hi everyone, my name is Mark Talaga. I'm the owner and director of the Center for Identity Potential, which is a mental health practice that specializes in working with gifted, 2E, neurodivergent, asynchronous kids, just very complicated therapeutic cases. I'm also the host of the Hopelessly Gifted podcast, a podcast that's also dedicated to educating parents and families about what it means to raise, support, and help educate gifted children.
That's amazing. And this is exactly what makes me really excited to talk to you today. In particular, I have a child as well. And some things, this was not the first time that we spoke, that resonated a lot. And I'm super curious how you end up creating the podcast and also the company that you have right now.
Right. Well, the podcast I created because the more I worked with families of these gifted kids, the more I kept coming up against some of the same scenarios and questions. And I thought a better way to support those parents rather than having them come in and talk with me is to check out a podcast that's free, available to everybody, and that goes into somewhat of a deeper dive into some of the specific questions they were asking. And as far as the center, I didn't found it. The founder of the center is a man by the name of Andy Mahoney, who was one of the pioneers in creating the field of counseling to gifted people specifically. Mm-hmm. So, he taught me almost everything I know, and then I took over the practice a few years ago. So I'm really just carrying the torch in his name, so to speak.
Okay, how amazing is that? And do you have like a particular personal connection that drew you to the center and also to the work that you are doing right now? Have you been a teacher, or have you been a gifted child in your childhood?
Right. It's a great question. And I don't have a straightforward answer because the way I got into this work is very, windy, I guess is the word. I originally was a video game producer. I worked for video game companies and did all that sort of work, which was, for a time a dream job. But I really struggled to keep up with a lot of the work, and my executive functioning was all over the place. And, eventually I was let go and I had to do some soul searching. And I went into the world of counseling because I received counseling when I was a teen and it was very helpful and I wanted to help others. And so I got connected through Andy kind of randomly. I wasn't ever seeking it out, but it's kind of the funny thing in life where once I connected with him and started learning about giftedness, I started to realize, whoa, that's my experience. That's everything I went through. That's a lot of the struggles that I had. And so I clicked to it very well. And once I started learning more about it, I really realized I was a gifted kid growing up, though I was never formally labeled.
Yeah.
But I definitely had a lot of the same experiences, which has helped me help others quite a bit.
Okay, that's really great to hear. And can you explain or tell us what are these specific experiences that have a gifted child have and that lead them to seek out counseling?
Let me actually back up a little bit and explain, because the word gifted is a loaded word, and a lot of people hear it and they think, oh, isn't that wonderful? Your child is gifted, their life will be easy, they will go to Harvard or Cambridge and they'll be just fine, and it's not really the reality, So giftedness, for the way we define it at our center, is when you have some part of your development, and it could be intellectual development, it could be gross and fine motor skill development, it could be language development, your moral justice development, any of these things, when it's in some level of an extreme, meaning it's outside of the norm by quite some ways, right? When a child grows up with some extreme in their profile, that typically would have us look at them through a gifted lens. And the kind of problem with it is when you have something that develops so extreme, outside of the norm, you have other areas of your life that are either in the relative normal range or even delayed. And so you have these really big gaps in your profile in how you develop. The more common way that most people look at gifted is, they're really smart, but like socially they're, not so good. And that's kind of a way under exaggeration. It's paints a very dim picture of what it's really like.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the kids that come into our practice are from parents who are like, I know my kid is very capable, very intelligent. School may have been very easy for them, or they just get things very quickly, but all of a sudden they're shutting down, or they're depressed, or they're so high-strung and anxious that they can barely function.
Yeah.
And they're maybe avoiding some of their responsibilities in life. And what we find is when we do a really deep evaluation and assessment of understanding who this kid is, we find out that there's a lot of those gaps that I talked about earlier, gaps that never really got recognized. And so it's when you start to highlight that being a gifted person means coming with a lot of what I like to call vulnerabilities in their profile, areas that are just underdeveloped and are very hard for them. You start to get a sense of why they might be shutting down or struggling or acting out or whatever the symptom may be.
Yeah. Okay, I get that. And I really want to make it more tangible in a way. And I ask myself, do you feel comfortable telling like what was your experience as the little Mark, how it expressed itself, that you had like certain skills that were overdeveloped, some underdeveloped, and what, let's say, challenges this brought into your life?
Yeah, absolutely. And it was one of those things where I was that kid where school was very easy. I could ace any test. Writing was a little bit challenging only because it was just hard for me to organize all my thoughts. Like I knew everything, but getting it out of me was tricky.
Yeah.
But then even after procrastinating to the 11th hour and getting my writing out, it would get an A. And so I never really learned my lesson that I need skills in writing. But it really came to a head in college for me, undergraduate, university, when I was out on my own for the first time. And what I had no awareness of was how much I struggled with organization and initiating and sustaining what we would all know as maybe the executive functions, right? How you take what you know and then make it real in a way. So I really fell apart in school. And I wouldn't go to classes. I would sleep in. I would, just kind of avoid things. And then I would try to save it in the 11th hour by resting on my natural ability. But it was a very harrowing experience. And I really, went into a pretty deep depression in college because of it. I couldn't understand why I was failing as bad as I was. And so I would blame it on, it was my career path choice that wasn't good, or it was these professors that were just being too, I would externalize the problem rather than have awareness that I was struggling or needed a lot more support. And so, that basically continued in my life. And even, I'm like, well, I'll work in video games then. That'll solve the problem because I'll be interested in it. And then I'll be performing well. And sure enough, no, these problems follow you everywhere. In relationships, all these kind of things. So my issues didn't really show up too early, though they were there for sure. But it was a very real experience where I just felt like I couldn't I just started to think I was dumb. Like, maybe I'm just not that smart. Maybe I'm not, because I couldn't be successful, quote unquote. And that was a very real experience for me that I started to understand a lot more as I was doing this work.
That's so fascinating. I think one thing that makes the problem probably very hard to recognize that you probably managed well enough that nobody was thinking that there's like something fundamentally wrong.
Right.
Yeah.
And that is a very common experience because gifted kids are really, really good at
Mm-hmm.
covering up where there's vulnerabilities. And so they
Yes.
really highlight where they're really good. And I happen to be, I could talk my way out of almost anything. And I had a little bit of charm to me, and I had a sense of humor that I could rely on.
Yeah.
And so I could always make a joke about what was going on. And I never really knew how to express the real feelings and pain and struggle I was having. And so, yeah, nobody really saw me as having a problem or even needing
Mm-hmm.
some level of special
Mm-hmm.
attention.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of kids slip through the cracks because of that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so interesting because it reminds me a lot of what I have experienced. The only thing that was a bit of a difference between in difference between your experience was that I was not a straight A student, but I had this uncanny ability to go through everything and or let's say matches whatever was expected of me, so I can go through it without maximizing what I had to do in that sense.
Right. Yes, absolutely. It's the old we say C's get degrees by our measuring scale. But yes, you almost learn that like school or your responsibilities growing up is a bit of a game, and you learn how to play the
Exactly.
game.
Exactly.
And so you use your intelligence to say, well, I don't really have to,
Yeah.
study for 10 hours. I can just kind of, figure out how to give an answer that's good enough. And that to me is still just as valid a gifted experience as anything.
You know what just comes up as a memory that I had, a fun memory when I was a child, was that I didn't do my math schoolwork for I think quite a bit. And what I did is basically I just got a friend to ask him whether I can have it from him, so I write it down in my exam book or whatever. And then when the exams came, I was literally figuring out while doing the exam how it works, and most of the time it clicked for me during the exams. But the funny thing was that, and this was the crazy thing, it came with a lot of stress. So you have to imagine, like, I was in panic for half of the exams until it just clicked.
Yeah, right. You're basically teaching yourself in the moment what you need to learn and then putting it down for the exam.
Yeah.
I mean, hyper stressful.
Yeah, but it worked out too well, as you expressed in your experience. So I went through all of that basically all my life, and it's still prevalent for me in that sense that, for instance, I can get away with a lot of less preparation because I can improvise very, 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 very well. And funny enough, you have already the inclination, but it gets better because you put it under different circumstance and all these different things. And it's really hard because on the one hand, you develop something that is extraordinary in one particular field, but on the other sense, you're totally lacking. And in particular, in my case, I had a really good intuition or intuitive understanding of things and systems and how they work out. So let's put it this way. I get very far with very, very little information. But the drawback is, until similar to your experience, I have to, let's say, put it into a workable framework that is understood by others. It takes me a lot of time and a lot of work. And this is a drawback.
Right, exactly. And it's, again, we look at it as a skill, the skill of how I basically reverse engineer what I know and what I can do or how I understand any idea so that I can put it into a framework and, give it to others so they're on the same page with me. Is a skill that gets underdeveloped over, because you learn how to get around it. And it's not the end of the world. And it gives you the ability to be a great podcast host and to be able to have conversations like this. And so it's not all bad, but we just notice these moments in life where we have that vulnerability that still exists, and it might prevent us from going to another level of ability or just reducing some of the stress that comes with some of the responsibilities we have in life.
Yeah. That explains also why you were talking in your podcast, Hopelessly Gifted, about that these kids, they excel in like these complex tasks, but what they are struggling with like very simple things.
Absolutely. And I mean, that is a gifted profile to a T. And actually, I had a kid that we worked with for a long time, really cool kid. And I can't say obviously too many details about him, but the idea was he was a whiz at physics. He had visited every single science museum, I think, in the country, like just absolutely loved it. Yeah.
Wow.
That kid couldn't spell his first name. I mean, he was in high school, he was in, like ninth grade, and the school, we had to work with the school, and they're like, oh, this kid isn't gifted. Because when you look at him, he kind of appears a little dumb almost. But I'm like, this asynchrony, this gap is probably the most extreme case I ever saw, but it really opened my eyes, like, that is what giftedness can be. And he could understand physics stuff far better than I ever will be able to. But yes, ask him to remember his home address and he'll stutter and kind of be like, oh, I don't know. And, it's in there somewhere. But, that level of extreme still qualifies to me as a gifted person. And the problem is people will say, well, we got to deal with all the deficits. We got to deal with the fact that he can't write clearly, and they miss the part where he still needs to be challenged and pushed. It just needs to have a very different scaffolding and way of delivering it, or having him deliver it to you, that needs to be taken into account.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And I think that's the reason where I think the school system is stifling these people, and they're like, in some cases, they lose their sense of confidence, and they lose as you described as well for yourself. You thought at some point that you were dumb. I had the same experience, that I was like, maybe I'm not that kind of smart at all. Maybe I'm even below average or whatever. So I think that's so important to see both of these things. And one thing that I just came to me is, like, for instance, still to this day, I have a spelling problem. It's like, and most teachers say, okay, you have to read a lot and then it gets better. And I'm like a heavy reader. I read around maybe 50 to 100 books a year. So this is not going to be
that's not
solved.
the issue. Right. But there's something in the brain that switches things around. It's not as clear as it could be. And on some level, a gifted person doesn't have to be good at everything, even though they might feel like, well, I could if I really tried, if I really worked hard. But it's like, okay, but let it go. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, just like, the biggest part for my work with these kids is when they really start to understand the whole of themselves. When they really start to understand, I struggle with, spelling or reading or writing or staying organized. It's a struggle for me. It's not that I don't want it, and it's not that in the right circumstance I can't do it, but it's a struggle. Then they can start to advocate and hopefully get some more support and help and be the ones that raise their hand, because the school system is not going to do it for them. It is not designed to work with anybody in an extreme developmental profile. It is designed for the average, which maybe it should be, maybe it shouldn't be, but that's what it is. And so it can be a very difficult place for a lot of really brilliant kids, where they start to not like school anymore, or feel like they never want to learn anymore, which is heartbreaking.
It is. It is. And it reminds me also to a conversation I had with my son, where his former teacher pointed out that he has very developed strategic thinking, and she recognized this during a game in sports. And we had this discussion, and I told him, like, that's great that you have that, but unfortunately in school you will not get grades for thinking in a good strategy. So the only way you can use it for your advantage in school is that you strategize your way through school. Maybe that's the only thing. But in real life, and this is the tragedy, in real life, being a good strategist is something that is very valuable, and can you get very far in your life.
First of all, you're a really good dad, because that's a really, really good thing to help him understand, man. That's it. Like, that is exactly what you need to help them understand. Like, you're I've even told kids that, they have severe ADHD, or they have these really strong learning challenges, or asynchronous learning profiles, where I'm like, look, school is not going to be what you excel at. The way school is, the way the system is, the way the game works, that's not where, so, don't judge your abilities and yourself and what you care about in this world because school sucks for you. You know what I mean? But you still need to get through it. And yes, you may need more help And you're going to have to recognize that it's not going to just come easy and you can't just do it all by yourself and try to be a lone wolf about it. But it also doesn't define you or your intelligence or your ability. So I love the message you gave to your son. I'm fully in line with that.
Oh, thank you so much. You mentioned something around learning or developing the executive function. I'm curious. So what role it plays in your counseling and how you approach it?
Absolutely. Well, executive functioning, if you look at it from a neurological perspective, basically it's the last part of your brain to develop. It's called the prefrontal cortex. I'm simplifying it a little bit, but it's the part of your brain that, yes, can take an idea and execute on it, make it happen. And because it's so underdeveloped, it doesn't really fully develop in a typical human being until, mid to late 20s, although there's a lot of science that says that might be not even correct. But it's the last part of the brain to develop. And so it's most prominent when you see really intelligent people who, just have maybe average executive functioning skill. But that's what it is. It's a skill. And you have to help people be aware of how that skill is playing a part in their life. So people like to say, oh, I'm a procrastinator. They use it as like a personality trait.
Yes.
And I'm telling them, it's not exactly a personality trait. You're not born with that. It's more like a defense mechanism. Where because your executive function skill is lacking in some area, you put something off. You're not able to initiate. And so what we try to do is we try to break down all of the executive functions into their subfunctions: initiating, sustaining, prioritizing, organizing, emotional regulation, metacognition, the list goes on. But each one of those can be developed. You can work on it. You can grow it like a muscle. Now, there's a limit to that. You got to manage expectations. Even if I were to work on it every day for the rest of my life, I'd still probably be at like a C plus, middle of the road executive functioning, where my wife is A plus, unbelievable. Thank God I have her because of how well she's able to utilize that part of her brain. But you also see how that plays a part in your relationships, right? You start to have a lot of interpersonal conflict in your life, and you realize because you haven't been staying on top of it, or you're not prioritizing it, or you're not staying emotionally regulated around, a loved one, that causes tension at times. And so you've got to realize it's not about just doing better in school. It's about how you manage yourself in your life and keep things in order and try to realize that it goes into almost every domain in your life. And in that therapeutic intervention of helping people understand that it's something tangible that can be worked on. It's not just about performance. It's about how you are in the world. That gives it a little bit more priority to say, hey, I should probably pay attention to where I might need some help in this or need to work on this a little.
Okay. And are you like actively training the executive function or this subcategories with the children that you are counseling?
If they're developmentally ready. And so I always tell my counselors that I'm working with, don't get behavioral too quickly, meaning don't jump right to, oh, you have trouble getting up on time? Let's teach you how to set up an alarm clock, because that isn't necessarily going to work. Gifted people intellectually know what they're supposed to do. They get like, yeah, I know if I took notes, I would be better in class. I know if I studied more, I'd be better. But there's an emotional component and a systemic shift that has to happen for them internally, where they start to realize that's really something I want to shift in my life. It's something that matters to me to get better at. Because if it doesn't, then I would be more about teaching them how they advocate for support and getting help with those things rather than building and training the skill. And so it kind of depends on who the person is. If they want to get better at it, yes, I'll teach them strategies for what it means to initiate or what it means to sustain with things and what it means to have more accountability in your life.
Yeah.
That kind of a thing.
Wow, it really sounds like that you are getting their emotional buy-in in a way, and also that you really try to understand where they are emotionally at.
But yeah, you have to, in a sense, even from a brain perspective, they've done fMRI scans on classically labeled gifted individuals. And what they found is that on average, their amygdala, their kind of fight or flight center, emotional core of the brain is twice the size of somebody in the more average range, of a more average brain. Feeling states are bigger, stronger, louder, more intense, last longer. And a lot of parents get very upset by this. Why is my kid absolutely freaking out because something small happened? Well, emotionally, it's huge inside of them. And so, unfortunately, what a lot of gifted people do is they start to feel like, oh, I'm too much, I'm too big, I'm too whiny, I'm too sad, whatever it is. And they start to push that down. But it's not gone. It's still there, but they have no idea how to integrate it into their lives. And so I'm a big believer that you have to have the emotional piece for a lot of these kids integrated into their experience, or else no, they kind of just hear you lecturing at them and then nothing really changes. You got to get in touch with them.
Wow. You're touching on something that is very deep, and it also reminds me to a conversation I had recently with my son. He just turned 13 2 days ago, and he wanted to have a mobile phone. And I have like a particular idea about mobile phones and adolescence, and in particular because of the development of the executive function, which is crucial to have a good life, as you explained. And he's quite acutely aware about that, because I showed him all the studies, and it's part of my work that I'm doing, right? And then he was asking me for having basically a no social media phone, or he was arguing that he could have one that have like a certain app on it where I can control what he's exposed to. And then I was like, yeah, that's true. And then he said something very, like, it moved me deeply. In that sense, he said like, yeah, daddy, but you have to trust me. It's about trust as well. And I told him like, yeah, I get it. And I fully trust you, but it's not that I don't trust you to give you that at that moment. It's only that I want to protect you from having that to your exposure, because when you start having that, you have to negotiate with yourself whether you want to indulge in something or not. So this creates additional strain on you. But that was a side topic. What really touched me in that moment was how sensitive he was, and how much he is like alive when it comes to like very deep emotions. And I'm always intrigued about his sensitivity. And the other thing, and this is what he mirrors to me, is that I was a also very sensitive child growing up, but I did exactly what you mentioned. I bottled it down. And now, with the understanding of the brain, I also understand when you have like an enlarged amygdala, I think I said it correctly.
Amygdala, yeah, you got it.
Yeah, thank you. Is the way you process emotions are enhanced. But the thing is with the brain is that this is a way of creating more neural pathways quicker and more deeply, because you experience more. That's the thing. And that's why it's so important to foster that. And also, I'm speaking to the parents that are listening, is when you have a child that has this sensitivity, that it's so important to validate their emotions.
Absolutely. Because all emotions on some level have purpose to them. You know, anger, frustration, you know, and when you have a really brilliant kid, or just a kid that's accelerated on some level, you know, they may have a vision in their head of what they want things to be. They're playing, you know, recess or in the park with kids, and in their head they have a vision of how the game that they're playing together is supposed to be. And then all the other kids decide to mess with the rules or break the rules or do it differently, and that kid loses it, and they're yelling and they're screaming and they're angry, and we're just trying to say, hey, it's not a big deal, it's just a game, calm down. But in reality, they feel helpless, powerless to create what they want to see in their head out in reality. And so it is this hugely emotional experience that they are like, I have no control here. I don't know how to get it other than kind of yelling and kicking and screaming to get my way. And they're not an overreactive kid. They just don't have the skill to create the change that they're looking for. And they may not have it until later on in life. That's okay. We don't need to rush anybody's development. But yeah, those feelings are very purposeful. And that
Mm.
sensitivity isn't just dramatic or attention seeking. Maybe sometimes it is. But you know what? I always say to parents, they're like, oh, he's just doing it for attention. I go, well, you know what? That kid needs attention. It's a need at that point for that child. They need to have something focused on them and the attention drawn to them. And so we don't dismiss that either. Now, we have to contextualize it and say, well, maybe the way they're getting it is maladaptive, but there might still be a need there. And so, with your son asking for the mobile and saying, you got to trust me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm touched by that when I hear it too, because it's something with him and you in particular, where he really wants to see his dad say, I think you can do this. But at the same time, you're a parent who wants to say, I'm not worried that your intentions are misplaced. I think your intention is to use that phone very properly, to use it properly. But because of your brain and where you're at and what you're trying to develop, I can kind of predict that you might have a little impulse control issue, or you might find yourself gravitating to it more than you think you will. And those are the things we want to look at, because that's just skill and underdevelopment in certain areas. And so we want to use the phone as maybe like a barometer to see where you're at with that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Because it's about how we hold each other accountable. I'll hold you accountable by making sure it's being used appropriately. You hold me accountable by helping me remember that I do trust you and that I do want to see you grow. And that's how we can really make this a positive experience overall.
Yeah, that is so true. And you summarized it greatly. Yeah, thank you so much.
Hey, absolutely.
One thing that I want to touch to is you mentioned that you were also very sensitive. And how did this was expressed by you when you were a child? Do you have like an example or?
Too many examples. I mean, I would cry at the drop of a hat. I got to think of it, because really what it was is, I was the youngest of my family. I have an older sister who's the oldest, and then a middle brother.
Mm-hmm.
And, I just really always wanted to do well in everybody's eyes. I was always praised for being really good at stuff and really quick and really smart.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of made it intolerable for me to be not good at stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so I can remember one time in particular, I think it was in junior high, which is like 7th or 8th grade in the States. And we were playing out in the front of the school, and there was snow on the ground. And we were throwing snowballs at each other. The school that I was in was kind of strict with that kind of stuff. And the principal ended up coming out and just yelling at all of us, saying, we're all in trouble. Go inside the cafeteria, sit down, we're calling your parents. I was in tears. I mean, completely crying. My other friends were laughing and like, oh, we got in trouble with the principal. Big deal. But I'm a mess. And, my mom came to pick me up, and she was even like, why are you crying? It's okay. It's fine. But I remember emotionally feeling like, this isn't who I am. I'm not the kind of kid that gets in trouble. I'm not supposed to be that way, and I don't know why this is happening. And one of my buddies is like, why are you crying, dude? Like kind of being like, what's going on with you? And I remember in that moment having to kind of come up with a lie, because I couldn't explain why it was so deep for me.
Yeah.
And so I was like, I'm afraid of my dad. My dad's the most gentle man ever. Like, he would never do anything inappropriate. But I'm like, oh, my dad's going to kill me. And he's like, oh, okay, I get it now. But I didn't know how to explain why I felt as deeply as I did, and why it was so upsetting for me to be in that position. And so, over time you learn, to not cry. And in my family, you could never be angry. Being angry meant that you were the problem. And so, like, I didn't learn how to metabolize anger. And and so a lot of these things you as a gifted kid, you just kind of figure out how to work your way around. And it wasn't until I was an adult that I met people who showed me that anger is life and it's energy, and it means you care about something, and it's passion, and it's something that can be utilized. And so, I try to teach parents that big emotions are telling us something important, and it's our job to eventually figure out what it is. But in the meantime, it's about keeping those kids safe and validating that those feelings are perfectly okay.
I wonder, when you had this like huge emotion, was it around the inner coherence that you felt, not the inner coherence that you are not that person, that you had like this strong moral understanding of who you are as a person, and you felt not aligned anymore with your
Right. It was an identity panic.
yeah,
My identity was I was the good kid. I was the kid that everybody
yeah,
liked, that never got in trouble. And so when I was faced with something that, started to push against that identity, it
hmm,
was like I was coming apart inside. And so my center is called the Center for Identity Potential because my
yeah,
belief is we really have to look at all the identities we have because we have tons of
yeah,
different identities. You and I have identities as podcast hosts,
hmm,
but that identity needs to fit us. You and I aren't going
hmm,
to be the same kind of podcast host. We have to have it express what we care about. Although I think you and I are actually probably more aligned than most people about what we care about. In my identity as a student, I never had it integrated that I could be kind of mischievous or I'm allowed to get in trouble, or sometimes I do like breaking the rules and pushing back against authority.
hmm,
And so it was that moment where I realized, I didn't know how to make that fit happen in the moment. And so I kind of came apart.
yeah,
And so, a lot of gifted kids who have an identity as being smart or capable, all of a sudden they hit a challenge or their executive functioning's blowing up or some other issues happening and they're failing.
yeah,
They come apart. They are
yeah,
not okay. They don't know how
yeah.
to deal with that.
That is it's really challenging the way you describe it, and I wonder what is it for the parents? Do you have like examples of what you encounter with parents, in particular when they're maybe not totally aware what is going on with their child? Is there a certain pattern that you recognize what is going on with the parents of a gifted child?
Yeah, probably the one example that jumps to mind the most is when they will paint their child as lazy.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he's failing school, but he doesn't do his homework. He's lazy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I don't like that word because it very rarely applies in actuality to what's going on.
Yeah.
Usually, again, most kids want to do well. They want to do
Mm-hmm.
well by their teachers and their parents and their peers. But when they can't, or the struggle is too hard, or they just don't know how to get themselves to initiate, or they have reading issues that are undiagnosed all of a sudden, and the words just overwhelm them, or whatever it may be, there's some sort of challenge. And so the work becomes overly difficult. But then parents will say, yeah, but when it comes to his video games, he'll play those all day long,
Mm-hmm.
and he has no problem initiating. And I'm like, yeah, it's apples and oranges. It's not the same.
Yeah.
Those games provide a framework and a structure, and they have purpose to them and dopamine hits, all that kind of stuff, to
Mm-hmm.
where they're able to bypass a lot of that executive function challenge.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have to really dive deep into why this kid is struggling as much as they are. And we find almost always that there is a learning challenge. There's something undiagnosed. There's those gaps that are
Mm-hmm.
there, but nobody saw them. And so I never blame the parents. The parents are doing the best they can.
Yeah.
The parents are really, they're helpless. They're like, we've tried everything and we don't know how to motivate this kid. So the only thing we can determine is it's their fault and they're lazy. And it's more of a miseducation, and they're not educated about
Yeah.
what's really going on rather
Yeah.
than they're bad parents. They're not bad parents. They're all very good parents. That's why they're bringing them to me. They're not
Yeah.
bad, otherwise they just write the kid off.
Yeah. It's so interesting the way you describe it. It also, as I said, like either it reminds me to things that I have with my son or myself. For instance, like as I mentioned before, I was like, maybe I could call myself lazy in school, but my mother used to buy me these Lexi cars, or like books with like amazing stuff in there, but I tend to read all of them. Like I had no problems doing the things that I'm excited about, but everything else is like, why should I care?
Right. Why should I care? Because again, there's some sort of demand being put
Mm-hmm.
on your prefrontal cortex in those contexts that make it like, oh my God, no, thank you. Like, it doesn't matter. Now, again, it might be you just have no interest in those things. And if you excel in
Mm-hmm.
them or not, who cares? That's not you. But
Mm-hmm.
if part of it ever bothered you, like, I wish I could have done those things better somewhere, it usually tells me that there is potential for you to do those things,
Mm-hmm.
but the struggle has just not been fully understood on what you might have
Yeah.
needed in order to learn it in the way that makes sense for you to get engaged with it and take it farther.
Yeah. Most of the time, I'm not sure how it is with your children that you are counseling, but most of the time it's a combination. When I think about it, back then it was either novelty or engagement in a way that excites me. So challenge and novelty in that combination that would engage me. And it did not, because it was based on a lot of repetition that was like boring, simply plain and boring. And there was also not really a lot of original thinking that bothered me a lot, because it was more repetition of what the teacher has said.
Yeah, well, that's another thing too, because on some level you were under challenged. You weren't given that higher level of thinking. You weren't seen for what you're able to do. So they wanted you just to do what the book says and follow the lesson in the order that it's given.
Yeah.
But when you have a child who's like, okay, I get this, I'm bored, I got it already, but they need something more. And if a teacher can give that to that kid and say, okay, you're able to, like, an example was, I had a kid that wanted to show me one of his drawings, and he did it in just pencil, and it was really well done. It was beautiful. And I said, okay, now do it in color pencil, because I knew somewhere that would be a challenge for them and there'd be a vulnerability. Now, this kid was like, no, it's good enough. I don't want to change anything. And I said, okay, no problem. But the idea is, for some kids, they're like, they need that scaffolding and challenge to stay engaged. So I always describe, a lot of kids will come in and say they're bored with school, right? It's boring. And I always look at that in two different ways. In one way, it's exactly like you described. I'm under challenge. I know how to do it. I'm doing the same thing over and over. I'm done with it. Or two, they're struggling so much to make meaning out of it and to follow it and to have it make sense to them in a way that clicks, that it's overloading their brain and they just shut down because they're bored by it. And so on some level, you have under challenge, and another level, you have over challenge.
Yeah.
And the challenge isn't the material necessarily, but it might be that the fact is your teacher talks for 20 minutes before arriving at anything that's valid, right? And so your auditory processing, trying to make sense of all that stuff you have to sift through to find something important, is being overtaxed, and you shut down. And so learning about all of these different patterns that arise for kids is very important for them to know what it means for them to learn something and learn something effectively.
That's so interesting. It really dawns on me, the way you describe all of this, that the primary challenge of these gifted children are an emotional one of, like, I just frame it that way, that they can refigure their motivational framework in a way that they can mobilize their skills for the mundane things that they need to do, not that they which they like to do. And that's the thing that when I summarized it correctly.
Yeah, no, you got it. I kind of love the way you put it, because it is important to understand, because I think where a lot of people fall into a trap is they try to convince these really brilliant kids that the mundane has some worth to it. Oh, yeah, I know it's hard, but it'll serve you later in life. That means nothing to that kid. That kid's like, you're full of it. But if you put it more in terms of, like, it is a real challenge because this is not how your brain works. It is not what drives you forward. And so you have a decision to make. Do you just say, forget it, I don't care about that thing, and I'll take whatever grade comes with it, and that's just the natural consequence of it? Or does that grade still matter to me? And yes, now you've got to get creative and strategic for how you're going to approach that issue. And a lot of times I'll work with schools and say, hey, this kid has demonstrated mastery in this topic. It is unfair for you to send them home with homework where they have to do 50 more problems of the same thing. They're never going to do it. It's overtaxing them. They're not developmentally able to walk themselves through emotionally, that they can just walk through it and get through it. And so let's reduce the workload as long as they're demonstrating that they do understand it. Because I'm not saying, like, skip the kid, he doesn't need to do work. It's more like, let's adjust to make sure we're not making this kid miserable and ruining their connection with learning.
That's so interesting. Also, like how you said it, in a way that we are doing a disservice. We make them miserable when we overload them with things from let's say, their perspective is mundane and not worth it to spend their time on. And I think when we reframe the whole task, for instance, like also like school is maybe, let's say, necessary to do, but it's maybe not as you described it before, when your teacher convince you that it will help you later in life, because it's a blend, it's a lie, basically.
Yeah.
In particular in our DNA. So I get that. I totally get that. And I think that is probably also what we are missing in school right now the most.
Right. And for me, I never want to say, don't force the kid to do any work that's hard. I'm not a believer in, just let him go. It's more like, where does this kid really need to build and develop a certain skill?
Yeah.
And that is where we're really trying to scaffold and support and meet them where they are.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? If they're like, I can't do 50 problems at the end of the day, okay, let's just meet them where they are. You know, let's scaffold it down and let's say, okay, but what we're building towards is more tolerance or emotional fortitude or an understanding that, you know, there's a necessity to learn some level of discipline around it. I don't know. But it has to connect with that kid as well.
Yeah.
That they have some sort of buy-in, emotional buy-in, where they see the value in it, or else they're just going to hear you yapping at them. They're going to nod their head and say, yeah, okay, I'll do it. And then they don't. So what are you doing, you know?
Yeah. I totally see that. Something else I'm totally wondering, and this is one of my topics that I, let's say, cover the most in different variations. So I got it. Variations is social media and what it does to the brain. I mean, social media and executive function, they're basically in war. But I wonder what is different for social media, or in the DNA of social media in particular, when it comes to gifted child.
Well, you know, social media to me is a problem across the board. And again, with giftedness, it's the same problem that everyone experienced, just in extremes. And so, you know, if a child is struggling with emotional regulation in an extreme, and then they're getting into some sort of comment war, or somebody's saying something nasty about them on Snapchat, and they just come apart, they're probably more vulnerable. That vulnerability still exists in all kids that are using it. You know, it's more like, what I try to help kids do is say, what is your intention in the use of social media? What are you intending in your connection with it? And they'll usually give me an answer like, well, I want to stay connected with my friends. And then we have to judge that against the reality. Is that really helping you stay more connected with your friends if we really look at it? Or is it not? Because this is where you have to start to evaluate for yourself, am I using it for the intended purpose, or is it getting away from me because I'm not protecting myself around it? Same thing with video games, same thing with really anything that you overindulge or are using maladaptively. So like, I have a rule at my house with my kids in video games. I love playing video games with my kids. It's the best. You know, I grew up as a gamer, and it's just a fun experience for all of us. But I have a rule. Games are supposed to be fun. The intention is that we're having a good time. The second it stops to do that, meaning kids are yelling at each other or they're getting frustrated, the game goes off because it's no longer serving its intended purpose. And I'm really trying to drill that into them, that they understand that any sort of engagement with whatever activity it is should be meeting your intention with it. And if it's not, then you got to be aware of that and then make a decision around it. But because they're too young they're 9 and 6, they're too young to say, oh, I should turn the TV off, I'm not having fun anymore, I got to kind of do it. So, it's okay. But I'm trying to put it in a context of, no, there's a reason we play these things and that I allow these in the house, because it is a privilege and it is up to me whether you get it or not. But it has to serve a purpose, or else I'm not down with it.
That's so interesting. I have also a rule about video games. Funny enough, I first education was in computer science because I enjoyed video games so much. Later, I realized that this has nothing to do with video games at all.
Really?
But what I wanted to get to is, my rule with my son is that, because I was deeply thinking about it, how he should navigate, for instance, like temptations of indulge in whatever hedonistic things he wants to do. And one of the things that he likes to do in particular when he's at my place is video games. And I said, okay, there's no particular rule besides of one, that you have to read for 1 hour and you have to do math rules for 1 hour, like 2 hours in addition, before you can play video games. And after that, when you did that, you can game as much as you want. Because one thing that is also my intention, maybe in framing it in that way, is that I want to give him the tools that he can also regulate himself, whether he's playing too much or playing less. And the other thing, I'm wondering whether you encountered also research about this topic, is that I have found out that gaming, video games, are like improving executive function under the precondition that it's not like Candy Crush or something, when there's a skill applied to it, and when there's a certain skill level, a threshold of skill and challenge that is applied to it, that it will serve the executive function.
So the research is interesting on that, because it does have some correlation that when you're gaming, that part of your brain is way more active and being strengthened and growing. The problem is that executive functioning really only stays in the context of that game, meaning it doesn't generalize out to almost anything. So it's not this kind of brain training tool that some people want to make it out to be, that, oh, if they're doing a really complicated game, then all of a sudden they'll be able to do complicated things in real life. No, because the game has such a rich framework and rules and coding that is specific to that game that they can excel there, but it's not necessarily going to translate out. Now, that being said, if you play something like a first-person shooter and you're training your eyes to look all over the map all at once, to visually process and see little glitches of where the enemy might be, that might translate to being like a flight traffic controller, where you have to scan a screen and look for little... I mean, that can happen, but it's not this kind of magic thing that all of a sudden makes you better at doing your laundry.
Okay, that's a really great analogy, and I get that. There's also, I think, there's only one game where I know from a fact that there's like a transfer effect, which is the NBEC. Maybe you are familiar with this. I
don't know if I am.
I think we always have like a variation of that game, and it was, when I remember correctly, it was created by the University Zurich or ETH, one of them. And it's basically that you have either sound or a visual cue of, I think it's 6 cubes, and then you have to remember, and that's why it's either 1 back or 2 back or 3 back. And this is like the only game that has like this transfer effect, that it increases your IQ.
Well, it would increase your working memory specifically, because your working memory is your ability to hold information online in time. And so you are training that part of, okay, I have to remember something in order in my head and utilize it in real time. So sure, that would be an absolutely a one-to-one. You're building up, working memory and strengthening that for sure. Just like, trying to memorize or something like that. I mean, there's that, but it is an absolute skill set that you could learn from that for sure.
Yeah, that's great. There's one more thing that I was wondering, because you were like in one episode talking about ChatGPT and how this can help gifted childs. I'm super curious about that.
Oh, yeah. The ChatGPT episode's kind of funny, because what I did in that episode was I basically pretended I was a parent of a gifted child, and I asked for, how do I help my gifted child? What do I do in these situations? And I printed out all the answers, and I basically read through them and then graded them on, is this actually valuable or not? And it was, like anything with AI and ChatGPT, a mixed bag. There were some things where they nailed it and it was very helpful and would be supportive of a gifted kid, and other things where they made it too simplistic and made it seem like, oh, if you tell them to do this behavior will change, and not necessarily. As far as ChatGPT and aiding kids, I think it's a great tool. But again, it comes with anything with me. What's your intention in it? What are you using it for, right? So for me, I try to use it intentionally, because, I'm trying to write a lot. I'm trying to write this book, and I need to get like a little prompt to get going. I probably won't use any of it, but like once I see something, that helps me just get my brain going so that I can start to write. That's how I intentionally use it. And I use it to organize, my notes and things like that. And so it's more of, are you using it intentionally to build up something or to support something that's a big struggle for you, like organization or getting your thoughts out in a way that makes them clear? Or are you just kind of using it to shortcut yourself to the end and have a finished product that's not really yours?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, mixed bag.
Yeah, but it's spot on. And I think if we use it as a tool as it is intended and not offloading, like, let's say, the cognitive heavy lifting, I think it's a wonderful tool. And one particular thing that really stuck with me is when I spoke with Lisa Riegel, and she was like, the results are nothing else than results. And the results are nothing else than context and biology. Context times biology. And she said, like, if teachers are mad because of that people or their kids are using ChatGPT for their homework, it's not ChatGPT who is in fault. It's basically the assignment who is not up to par with the tools that are available for us today. And I think that's a good way to see it.
Yeah, I'd like it as you got to adapt. It's not going anywhere. ChatGPT isn't disappearing. It's only going to get bigger. And so, yes, we as a human race and in education especially have to say, okay, that means that certain ways of thinking, certain ways of producing original thought and organized thought and writing have to be adjusted because we still need the skill of expression. We still need verbal expression, written expression to whatever degree a person has that. But you got to make adjustments for sure because, what else are you going to do?
Can you tell us more about the book that you are writing? I'm super curious about that.
Right. So it's definitely in early stages, but I would say I got a good chunk. But it's really for parents in their battle to help regulate screen time at home. So I really made it about video games because that's such a common issue that comes to the door for a lot of these kids. Not all of them, but a lot of them really struggle with regulating around screen time. Parents feel out of control with it at home. Kids make it seem like this is the only way I can talk to my friends. This is where all my friends are. And it just creates a very tricky situation for a lot of households. But really, it's more about how complicated it is to change a family dynamic. I kind of use video games as the flavor of what we're talking about, but it's really about what it really means to change family dynamics and structure and where the power is and how we align with our children and what we need to understand about the challenges that our kids are having and emotional expression. It goes into all the stuff I talked about.
Yeah.
But using video games and screen time and management of it as the kind of example of how that can look to make things more malleable and helpful in a household.
That sounds super exciting. Are you familiar with the work of Jonathan Haidt, in particular with Anxious Generation?
I'm familiar with it. I don't know if I've read it, though.
Yeah, because I think it's a bit a different subject matter in that sense that it's, let's say, it's of course, let's say, very realistic in a sense that it's not inspirational because you have to go through a lot of, like, let's say, heavy stuff around what is going on with mental health and all these different things with our children before it gets to the, let's say, aspirational stuff with how we can change it. But it's a similar subject because it's more around also managing display time, and also it's, as you said, like dynamics and more display time about mobile phones rather than video games. But at the end of the day, like, the arguments and the dynamics are probably very similar. And I also get that when you have this social driver that is huge because it's innate, everybody is seeking connection. And when is from their perspective is the only way they connect with their friends. This is something that is huge. I'm super curious about that.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I'll have to read that book too because I want to make sure I'm hearing where people's opinions are in that thing because it's such a prevalent topic and it gets into loneliness that
Yes.
it's an epidemic and people are feeling more lonely than ever. And I think the gifted population, like everything, is just in extremes and they maybe feel it a little more intensely. But what it means to connect and the idea that it is not a moral failure, but there is frameworks and skills that you need to understand about yourself of what it really means to connect and how to find your people. Because my concern with, kids saying, well, all my friends are online, that's probably
Mm,
true. And I don't think you need to lose that. But there's a
mhm.
limited belief system underneath that says, I don't know how to make them in real life.
Yeah.
And there's this idea that that's not going to happen for me. And I like to challenge that with people
Hmm.
because it's this idea that anything that you need to create and make happen is possible, but you got to take into reality how difficult it may be and where the vulnerabilities are that need to be discussed first. And so my book goes into a lot of that part as well.
Okay. So, looking forward to that. When we can expect to read it?
I'll reach out to you, Rudy, about that one. But say, my hope is that I'm finished with it this year. But that's as far as I've got as far as internal
Okay.
deadlines for myself. But I'll tell you what, when it comes out, I'll come back on or you can come on mine and we'll talk about it.
Yeah, that's a really great idea. We're going to do that. I'm wondering about one additional thing is when you could change something about the education system, what would that be?
It needs to be reworked completely. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
honestly, I'll make it simple. The more that the educational system starts to adjust itself to support the outliers in learning,
Mm-hmm.
the more that they start to deal with, giftedness and what it really means in those gaps, the better off they will be at teaching the general population. My belief is when you really alter a system to deal with the extremes in a better way, it helps everybody. It's not a either or. It's not, oh, now you're not going to help these kids and you're only focusing on the gifted. It doesn't work like that. And
Yeah.
so I wish there was a little more buy-in to saying, let's adjust our educational methodologies to incorporate these really unique divergent learners because that will help everybody overall.
Yeah, I agree with that. In particular, because even, let's say, normal gifted people, they have also divergence in what they are particularly good at or not. And I think if we can account into that everybody has their, let's say, certain outliers or certain things that are easier for them or more challenging. And I think if we can account for that, we create an environment that will foster the talents and also will give you an outlet for the things that you're struggling with, because I think that's kind of normal.
Yeah.
That
It's all
skills.
humanness. It's all
Exactly.
human. There's
Exactly.
nobody's getting away from that unifying cause. You know what I mean? Even
Absolutely.
if the issues appear extreme and different in the gifted, it's still human development. It's still what we all struggle with. It's very relatable, if you really look at it. So, yeah, I like what you're saying.
Great stuff. Is there something particular as a message that you want to share that was not expressed yet?
I think I'll just underline the last point is that all development is human development. And even though it
Mm-hmm.
looks strange and weird and out there and quirky and doesn't fit into a norm, it's still a relatable experience. And so if you take the time to realize that a person's very quirky behavior has purpose to it, has an
Mm-hmm.
intention and a function underneath it, you have a better job of understanding that person, understanding how to relate to them, how to connect to them. And if we jump too quickly to pathologizing people's behaviors that are out there and, oh, well, that's just, them being rude or, disobedient, you tend to lose the relationship with that usually a kid or that person. And I just challenge people to maybe open up their mind to there's more reason to why that person's doing what they're doing than you think.
That's great. Great how you summarized it. Mark, it was a great pleasure speaking to you. You opened up my mind to a lot of ideas and put also a lot of experience of myself in perspective, and it was a huge pleasure.
Absolutely. I had the best time. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.